thanks to that great lineup of speakers. I mean, if you think about the global issues that we need to address, and to address them at the local level, the tribal community level, at the level of the highest levels of the UN human rights system, at the highest levels of the US government, at the tribal level. What we are trying to do in that first part of the program is really give you a sense of the lay of the land, the financial lay of the land, the community lay of the land, the social, the economic, the role of racism. Again, I just want to thank the folks who helped organize this and put this all together. Amy Pettifer, Gabby Brain, Vishal Gaikwad, Mele Moniz, and particularly Melanie Clerk. Melanie knows everybody. It's amazing all the people that she was able to help get for us to be at this event. So again, the theme of the conference is racism, conservation, and indigenous peoples. And so in putting the program together, we thought it'd be a good idea to have a class, a lecture, and who better to lecture than me? So I have my little Apple timer here, okay? So when that goes off. Who shall live and who shall die? Racism, conservation, and the biopolitics of indigenous rights in international law. Talking about racism, as I've been talking about it and teaching about it and writing about it for 40 plus years, as a law professor, as an indigenous rights advocate, as a teacher, is difficult because everybody has their own definition of what racism is. It's like when the Supreme Court said, I know pornography when I see it. Don't ask me to define it. I know racism when I see it, or at least I think I know. And so very early in my career, I was trying to work around this and work with this problem of defining racism, and I came upon the work of Albert Memmi. Albert Memmi was a Tunisian Jew, born in 1920, suffered through the Nazi occupation of Tunisia, was a Jew in a Muslim society, and went on to become one of the most influential teachers and writers on the issue of the colonizer and the colonized. And in his book entitled Racism, well, that's a pretty bold move. What's your book about? Racism, everything. In his appendix, in his most famous essay, he attempted a definition. And I found this definition very helpful in my work because I don't have to take responsibility for it. Blame Albert Memmi. Memmi describes the structure of racism in 4 moments. The racist insist, and the use of racism always insist on difference between the racist and his or her victim. They are black, I am white. They are hunter-gatherers, I am a manufacturer. They raise their children different from us. They don't have laws, and we do. There's that difference. Then the racist imposes a negative valuation on that difference. Our ways are better. Our color is better. The way we use the land is better. The next racist moment is when this negative valuation is applied to the entire group. All black people are inferior to white people. The way that you raise your children, all of you, we're going to take all of your children and put them in residential schools because we think we do it better. We manage conservation better than you because you are savages, you're primitives, you're backwards, you're pastoralists, you're not hunter-gatherers. And then the most important part of the structure of racism is the use of this generalization to legitimize racial hostility and violence. Because of your racial inferiority, we can forcibly remove you from lands that you've lived on forever. We can take your children from your homes and put them in residential schools. We can take your land forcibly at gunpoint and put you onto a reservation. And we have a reason for doing this. We have a justification. Memi's insight is that you can't really be a racist unless you can implement your justification, because that's when it really matters. In his book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, written in 1957, really at the height of the African and Asian decolonization movement, Memi writes, racism is ingrained in actions, institutions, in the nature of colonialist methods of production and exchange. Political and social regulations reinforce one another. And here I highlight his words. Since the native is subhuman, the Declaration of Human Rights does not apply to him inversely, since he has no rights. He is abandoned without protection to inhuman forces. And when I read those words again last night, just how strongly they resonated for me with the theme of this symposium, and how concisely they describe what racism is and how it functions. My students are all going to smile because I'm next going to talk about Michel Foucault. I actually bring a little puppet doll of Michel Foucault with me that I talk to all the time. Okay, I strongly urge you to order it and support the company that had the brilliance to have puppet dolls of famous philosophers. Foucault, of course, if you're at a cocktail party and say, well, who was the most influential thinker of the 20th century? You can't go wrong if you cite Foucault. He's everywhere. He's the main target of the anti-crit, critical race theory movement. He's the main target of conservative think tanks. Everything that's wrong with wokeness, you can trace back to Foucault. And Foucault, late in his career, turned to the issue of racism. And it's interesting, this probably, arguably, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, recognized that racism is inscribed at the basic mechanism of power as it is exercised in modern states. In other words, without racism, no modern state. This appears in his 2003 book, Society Must Be Defended. Foucault defines racism there, again, as the mechanism by which the state exercises the right to make live and let die. Foucault calls this form of power biopower, power over bodies. Think about it. We cede, as part of the social contract, the power over our bodies to the state through the draft, through capital punishment, through imprisonment, through the way we raise our children. This is what Foucault means by this all-encompassing idea of biopower, the power of the state and the group sanctioned and licensed by the state to decide who shall live and who shall die. Who shall live and who shall die? These are pictures of Ogiek homes burned to the ground during evictions by the Kenyan authorities. According to Foucault, racism establishes the racial subject, the Maasai, the Yaqui, the Ogiek, the Adivasi, establishes that racial subject as the threat to the social body that needs to be removed from society via means of institutions, residential segregation, prisons, and for our purposes, protected areas. And I want us to think about this. Foucault calls racism the governing apparatus The modern state doesn't work without this governing apparatus that is used, again, sharing the same basic insight as Albert Memmi, that is used to justify the exercise of the sovereign right to kill in an economy of power, an economy of power. I want us to think about that term. What is the economy of power? Of the conservation, what I call the conservation industrial complex. Supposedly concerned with the life and well-being of the population. What is the economy of power represented by the conservation industrial complex? Well, here it is, and we'll share this PowerPoint. This was put together by Survival International. Our next speaker ably represents them in their struggle for the protection of Indigenous peoples' human rights. This is the board members. And when I call it the conservation industrial complex, it's because there's a lot of heavy-duty industries involved in this board. You have Texas Gas. You have Blackstone. You have the World Bank. You have Emerald Oil. You have Diamond Offshore. Why are these people on the board of the World Conservation Society? This is, in fact, the economy of power of conservation. What is the economy of power of conservation controlling, or the economy of power controlling conservation in Africa? A recent article in African Arguments revealed big conservation NGOs are majority governed by finance figures. You see that map? You see all those dollar signs? African Arguments looked into the backgrounds of individuals that sit on the boards of Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the World Conservation Fund, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, or the, mine is cut off. The Wildlife Conservation Society. The Wildlife Conservation Society, and it found that just over half of those board members, 111 board members of Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, represented by those dollar signs, are connected to finance on the boards of those four major players of the conservation industrial complex in Africa. That is what Foucault means by the economy of power. What is the economy of power represented by the carbon cowboys in Africa? The Guardian published an article last week. We don't know where the money is going. The carbon cowboys making millions from credit schemes. Quoting from the article, nature-based carbon markets have largely been co-opted by groups affectionately, I don't know why they're affectionately known in the industry as carbon cowboys. I guess these are the romantic figures of the Wild West going out to conquer the savage. These groups spent much of the last 15 years snapping up and enrolling large tracts of land in the developing world with little care for indigenous rights or ensuring that local inhabitants get paid for their conservation work. Quoting from Elias Ayre, who works for Renoster, that reviews the quality of these carbon projects, it's common for developers of carbon offsetting projects to force local and assert local communities, indigenous peoples are the main beneficiaries of their initiatives. So they really want to emphasize that. Yet, if you look at these, and investigation after investigation shows that these claims are usually universally given the secrecy reigning over projects, revenues, and expenses. Only companies running the project really know how much money is trickling down and how much their executives and business partners are cashing in. Well, we can figure that out ourselves. Just go to Vox. What is the voluntary carbon market in this economy of power? And again, this is from Vox. It's defined as a decentralized space where people and businesses can choose to buy credits to offset their emissions. The market for these offsets, which is largely unregulated, could hit $50 billion as soon as 2030 and grow 100-fold by 2050, according to McKinsey consultants. This is what Rebecca was talking about in her presentation. Ecology calls itself the Spotify of sustainability. If you could tell me what the hell that means, come up afterwards, okay? I'm not sure what that marketing concept is, but it scares the living daylights out of me, given what Spotify, many artists feel, has done to new artists in the recording market. They anticipate a revenue growth of over 200%. Carbon offsets are traded in marketplaces like US-based Expansive, which offer real-time prices for different kinds of offsets. Again, Rebecca's point in leading off this conference. Fungible environmental products. These marketplaces facilitated the movement of 500 million metric tons of financialized carbon in 2021. JP Morgan's Timberland Fund has plowed $500 million into carbon offsetting in the pine forests of the US South. Are we getting an idea of Foucault's esoteric concept of the economy of power? Here it is. All you have to do is just read the internet to find out what that economy of power is. What is the economy of power for conservation travel in Africa? We've been working on the role of the large conservation groups with respect to fortress conservation, and we just Googled up tourism, and lo and behold, the World Wildlife Fund has entered into a partnership with a private for-profit group called Natural Habitat, just focusing on the Ngorongoro crater and the conservation area where the Maasai are under threat of eviction of 100,000 Maasai by the government, as the government of Tanzania pursues conservation in the NCA. And it pursues tourism heavily. Over 600,000 tourists travel to the Ngorongoro conservation area each year. And the government has announced plans that it could attract many more, 5 million tourists by 2025, bringing 6 billion a year with them, according to the government's recent plan. Interestingly, since 2003, World Wildlife Fund has partnered with a for-profit corporation to, quote, offer curious travelers the opportunity to explore the world's wild places. They offer more than 100 of these tours. Go to the webpage, just do Natural Habitat, and the logo of World Wildlife Fund is all over the place. They offer more than 100 of these tours on every continent, and NatHab, which, as it advertises itself, boasts it's provided more than $6 million to support World Wildlife Fund's global conservation efforts, and will continue to give gross sales plus $174,000 annually by 2028 in support of the World Wildlife Fund. In addition, there are other benefits of bringing these well-heeled tourists. This tour, by the way, starts per person for 10 days at $13,395, and that's your basic, okay? There are upgrades with a minimum of 12 persons per tour. And the World Wildlife Fund is sponsoring this tour and allowing its name to be used to promote this tour while the Maasai continue to be evicted from the NCA. And if you look at the 100 different tours that this partnership sponsors, many, many of them are in protected areas where indigenous peoples have been forcibly evicted. NatHab reports that its business customers have donated an additional $40 million in support of world wildlife priorities. Again, are we getting a clearer picture of the economy of power for the global conservation industry? This is a picture of conservation in the Ngorongoro crater. If you go to TripAdvisor and say, should I go to the Ngorongoro crater? Everyone says, it's fabulous, but the crowds are nuts. Go this time of year, go that time of year. You have to be strategic about when you go because of the conservation efforts now going on in an area where the Maasai continue to be violently, forcibly, and voluntarily evicted from their lands. All in the name of this model of conservation that originated in the United States. And the Sierra Club and John Muir, and the eviction of indigenous peoples from Yosemite and other national parks in the early 20th century. It's a conservation-based model based on the belief that biodiversity protection is best achieved by creating protected areas where ecosystems can function in isolation from human disturbance so that we don't have so many Jeeps on the road, I guess. What is the economy of power? Represented by indigenous peoples and risk to the industrial conservation complex. And this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we begin to follow the money. The global conservation industrial complex knows that indigenous peoples are a risk to your project. And there's two ways to deal with risk. You can eliminate it, or you can try and bargain and negotiate to reduce your risk and exposure. That's not the way that the global conservation industrial complex approaches risk. As Rebecca Adamson's research shows, you have to understand, you take that complex, you take Goldman Sachs, you take Blackstone, you take the heavy-duty financiers, and they're the ones loaning millions of dollars to these companies to purchase carbon credits in Africa and Asia. And they put all the money up front to purchase it, but the company doesn't want to pay all that money. It's just like you. You don't want to pay all your money for your house at once. You don't want to pay all your money for your car at once. You put it on a long-term loan. These loans are incredibly leveraged. Climate financing is 61% debt. So the banks, the finance institutions that are integrated into this complex are invested in the success of these carbon capture schemes and tourism, ecotourism. And they know there is a high risk when you consider 56% of carbon storage and 50% of inland waters are represented. And as the ESG Investor article by Rebecca says, indigenous rights can materially impact investment risk, credit events, and company operations. A recent study by Wharton ESG Material Credit Events found that projects operating on indigenous lands are within a 10-kilometer distance at as high as a 500% higher material events than those operating farther away. It's because the indigenous people don't want you there. And they're going to resist and they're going to fight, and that creates risk. And that's the real issue, is how does the industrial complex, the conservation industrial complex, deal with that risk? And unfortunately, the economy of power that exposes itself to that risk when it invests in these conservation schemes, when it invests in 30 by 30, when it invests in what is called conservation travel. Who shall live and who shall die? Remember Memmi's structure of racism and the 4 moments. The insistence on difference. Why did this happen? Well, they don't share the same conservation values as we do. They are poachers. They grow corn. They interfere with migratory patterns of the rare exotic species that we want our tourists to expose themselves to. And that's bad. We don't like that. That gets in the way of what we want to do. what we are putting money out to purchase those carbon credits in Africa and Asia. And it's all of them. All the Maasai have to go. All the Indians in Yosemite had to go. All of you must be forcibly evicted. And we're doing it for the good of the state, for the good of the world, for the good of the majority, for the good of everybody. Who shall live and who shall die? The governing apparatus here is racism. It is racism which justifies the fortress conservation model. It is racism, at least according to Memi, which justifies the forcible evictions of indigenous peoples, the murders, the rapes, the assaults that Francisco has described in his report. Without racism, the conservation industrial complex, I would argue, could not exist, because he needs racism to justify the exercise of that sovereign right to kill. When states in alliance and licensed allow these groups, this economy of power, to say what it views as life and well-being of the population. Quoting from Francisco's report, the exclusionary approach to protecting biodiversity, known as fortress conservation, continued to prevail and has led to violent evictions, militarized violence, dispossession of the lands of indigenous peoples. They're the best stewards of nature. According to participants, indigenous peoples are in most cases not consulted. They are forced to relocate. Participants highlighted that the eviction of indigenous peoples or denial of their access leads to the loss of irreplaceable land, sacred places, resources, transmission of knowledge systems, culture, language, identity, livelihoods. You separate indigenous peoples, and you don't have to, you just ask the Yaqui about this. You separate indigenous peoples from their lands, you've destroyed the culture, you've destroyed the people. You've destroyed their cultural survival, their cultural identity, and their cultural integrity. So what does all this have to do with international law? What is the relation between racism, conservation, and international law? My last topic. Well, blame it on the Pope and the doctrine of discovery. When Europeans stumbled upon the New World, they found it occupied by people who were different. They didn't venture very far from the coast, so they assumed everybody was like that. In North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Africa. They went with the presumption that they would encounter different people. And their difference, they weren't Christian. They didn't worship our God. They didn't raise their families. They didn't use the land the way we did. They are inferior, all of them, so we can enslave and colonize all of them. Pope Alexander donates the New World to Spain on the basis of Columbus's discovery, on the authority of God. This is the economy of power in the colonial era. It's tied to the authority of God. That's a pretty strong economic argument. Where do we get the authority to take your lands, to enslave you, to send your children to residential schools? From the power of God. However, if you look in yellow, you can conquer any indigenous peoples you find anywhere in the world, but so long as they don't belong to a Christian prince or people. And that is the apparatus that international law has allowed the colonizing states to use up until late 20th century. It's the justification for colonization. I will finish up. See that? Okay. So as Marshall says in the first case in Western world to talk about the rights of indigenous peoples, he explains the doctrine of discovery and this presumption that Europeans traveled with them, that indigenous peoples had no property rights that we had to respect. The character and religion of its inhabitants, the difference, the generalization of the difference, the negative assignment to that difference, and here's the justification. The character and religions of indigenous peoples afforded an apology for considering them as a superior people, as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. However, they all wanted all that land. Does this sound familiar? This is what's going on in Africa and Asia. This is the economy of power driven by this underlying legal assumption that the peoples who had been colonized by Europeans and who took over the governance of those former colonies in Africa and Asia adopted as well. They incorporated that presumption that indigenous peoples are inferior and have no rights that trump ours. Why? Because conquest, Marshall says, gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. And I want us to appreciate the sweep, the global sweep of that economy of power that created European and American colonial empires in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. All the green area was colonized by Europe. It actually should be brown and black and red, because that's who the people of Europe colonized. And as the Special Rapporteur report notes, this economy of power, which uses racism as its primary mechanism to justify its policies in conservation and tourism, is especially dangerous for indigenous peoples, because they comprise less than 5% of the world's population, but protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so what is the solution to the use of international law as an apparatus, as a mechanism of using racism to justify the violation of the human rights of indigenous peoples in protected areas? And that is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I first heard about Francisco when I was in Geneva at the working group back in the 80s, and he was just as funny and charismatic and important and a brilliant strategist that I've come to know as well, and was there when these principles were adopted. And the first thing in the preamble of the Declaration is, it says, any doctrines, policies, practices based on advocating the superiority of peoples, remember Marshall, the character and religion, is racist. Hey, you guys got the R word in there. We don't like to see that word, but you insisted that this is all about racism. Scientifically false, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. And so today, through the efforts of indigenous peoples, through the efforts of many of us here and in our audience, I know from looking at the participant list, many of you I remember back in Geneva. Many of you I've seen at United Nations and OAS and other human rights forums advocating for Article 26, which basically says we have the rights to our lands, our territories, and resources, which we've traditionally owned. We have the right to redress. And finally, we have the right to free and prior informed consultation. So class, there will be a test available on the internet. It'll be anonymously graded. You will be tested on Foucault and Memi and the conservation industrial complex, and I thank you very much.